One book at a time. Today's selection is The Crowd, a study of the popular mind.
Hello, everyone. Have you ever wondered about this seemingly paradoxical question? Why is it that people you know to be extremely intelligent, the elite minds of society, such as an erudite professor of philosophy who can debate ethics all day, or a skilled doctor who can save thousands of lives, when they gather into a group or a crowd, can act in an incredibly stupid and even barbaric manner? It sounds hard to believe, but try to imagine this scene of a frenzied crowd at a sporting event where thousands of people shout and curse at the referee's decisions while sometimes brawling or destroying property. Or a bit further back in history, with riots and mass movements that drive humans to actions that, when alone, they would certainly never consider. Those individuals, when returning to their daily lives, can be exemplary citizens, or gentle fathers and mothers and kind friends. So what happened to their intellect, along with their reason, and even their conscience, when they merged into the crowd? This is not a hollow question, but a paradox that has haunted thinkers for centuries, and perhaps has never become so urgent as in the digital age when a crowd can form in just an instant on social media. It is here that we meet the core concept of Gustave Le Bon, a French social psychologist living at the end of the 19th century, in his classic book titled Psychology of Crowds, or The Crowd, a study of the popular mind. Le Bon pointed out that when a person merges into a crowd, he is no longer himself. The individual self seems to vanish to make room for an anonymous and powerful collective soul. That is an entity with its own thoughts, along with feelings and actions, which are sometimes very different or even opposed to each individual composing it. You see, when we become part of a crowd, whether it is a protest or a viral trend on TikTok, and even a group of enthusiastic fans, our individual consciousness can be pushed back to make room for primitive emotions along with herd instincts. Provocation, along with emotional synchronization and the illusion of collective power, can turn a wise person into a blind one, or a calm person into an aggressor. In this video, we will together decode the psychological mechanisms behind these phenomena. We will explore how Le Bon dissects that collective soul to understand why the crowd is so easily provoked by empty words along with symbolic images, and why it lacks the capacity for critical thinking to such an extent. My goal is to help you not only understand, but also be able to protect yourself from the traps of crowd thinking, while identifying when you or those around you are being swept into its whirlpool. So how a collection of superior minds can turn into a mass of primitive and easily provoked emotion. Please join me in deep diving into the book Psychology of Crowds by Gustave Le Bon to find the answer. Let's get started. Chapter 1. the law of mental unity, the vanishing of the I. Have you ever experienced the feeling of standing in a sea of people? It could be an explosive concert or a breathtaking football match, and even a simmering protest in the middle of the streets. That feeling where your individual I, along with private thoughts and petty worries, seems to vanish to merge into a giant flow of energy. At that time, you are no longer a solitary individual, but part of a larger and more powerful entity. If so, then congratulations, because you have touched the threshold of the law of mental unity, which is one of the central ideas that Gustave Le Bon explored in his masterpiece, titled The Crowd, a Study of the Popular Mind. And in our Chapter 1 today, we will together dissect the formation process of that strange psychological crowd, along with the way our I suddenly vanishes. Le Bon calls this the law of mental unity, and although it sounds academic, the idea is extremely intuitive. He says that when people merge into a crowd, then individual intelligence, along with reason and careful analysis, seems to be set aside. These factors do not completely disappear, but their power is obscured to make room for a common unconscious personality to form and dominate all behaviors. Imagine this when each of us is an individual drop of water with its own shape, along with color and characteristics. But when we flow into a large river, then we no longer keep our original form. We form a unified and more powerful entity to sweep away everything in our path, while possessing a potential power that each individual drop of water could not possibly have. The crowd is the same because it does not think with reason, but with emotion, along with simple images, and sometimes the most primitive instincts, making your rational and analytical I temporarily give way to an instinctive and emotional we. So, what is the mechanism that makes our I be obscured so quickly when Le Bon points out two main factors, which are emotional contagion and hypnosis? Imagine an emotion such as excitement or anger, and fear can spread in the crowd faster than a virus. It does not need a logical reason or evidence, but only needs a few individuals to start expressing it for others to quickly imitate and be infected, just like a yawn. One person yawns, then the second, and the third, and so on yawn, along without needing to know the reason. In a crowd, then this mechanism is pushed to the extreme when the fear of one person becomes a common fear, and the joy of a group turns into the euphoria of the whole sea of people. And what is more worth mentioning is that the crowd is very susceptible to hypnosis, because Le Bon believes the crowd is in a state almost like a person being hypnotized. A powerful word or a decisive gesture from a leader, along with a repeated image, can plant ideas and emotions in the mind of the crowd, just like a hypnotist leading his subject. In this state, then the ability to criticize is paralyzed, and the crowd accepts every suggestion without needing verification or deep thinking, when they act according to what is suggested rather than according to their own logical analysis. To visualize more clearly, then, let us go back to personal experiences when you stand among tens of thousands of fans in a stadium. Shouts of joy explode when the home team scores, and you automatically shout along, then wave your arms in the air and even jump up. Maybe before that you didn't care much about football, but at that moment, you are part of the collective joy when the common emotion of victory or defeat becomes yours regardless of whether you are a diehard fan or not. Your usually calm and rational I temporarily disappears to make room for the enthusiastic as well as instinctive we. Or another slightly more powerful example is a protest where a normal person who is usually shy and timid can become unexpectedly brave when merging into the flow of people. Collective power brings them a sense of safety along with confidence, and even urges them to act that when alone they would never dare. Slogans shouted constantly along with emotions of anger or hope are spread, making the individual I with its own fears vanish into the we with a common purpose and a power amplified many times over. Thus, in this first chapter, we have seen that the crowd is not just a collection of many individuals, but a new entity with its own psychology, along with unconsciousness and susceptibility to provocation or hypnosis, where the individual I temporarily gives way to the collective we. The vanishing of the I is not necessarily a loss, but a transformation to create a giant power that we will learn more deeply about in the next chapters regarding its characteristics and fearsome powers. Chapter 2: Characteristics of the Crowd, Impulsive and Changeable. In this chapter, we will dive deeper into the mind of the crowd to start with one of the most distinct characteristics, which is the impulsiveness and changeability of the crowd. Our goal in this section is to describe this fickle, together with the lack of control and sometimes very frightening nature of the crowd. You should imagine it like this: when an individual merges into the crowd, then he seems to shed the coat of reason along with personal will, so that the most unconscious and instinctive part within each of us rises up. Things that we would normally try to control to fit into society suddenly take absolute control. Le Bon describes the crowd as a creature enslaved by immediate impulses, as they do not act according to a plan or a long-term goal, and even not according to any fixed moral principle. Whatever stimulates them at that moment, then that thing will be carried out immediately, whether it is a noble, heroic act, or a terrible crime, because they do not distinguish between good and bad in an objective sense, but simply react. This reminds me of an overgrown child who only acts according to spontaneous emotions without any consideration of consequences. 1 second before then, the crowd could be captivated by a benevolent and selfless idea, but the very next second, just a small impact is enough for them to turn 180 degrees to plunge into an extreme and aggressive behavior. Like a river with water just flowing according to the terrain without calculating the destination, then the crowd only follows the law of gravity along with random obstacles on the way. This is exactly why the crowd cannot think logically or calculate and think systematically, because their entire cognitive capacity seems to be focused only on feeling directly together with strongly and often exaggeratedly. An idea or an image planted in the mind of the crowd will not undergo a process of analytical dissection. Like when an individual receives information, but it is received intact or rejected outright based on what emotion it evokes. If it touches on fear or hatred or a certain longing, then it will spread quickly like a fire on dry grassland. The crowd has no capacity for doubt or objective criticism because they only see everything as either white or black, and either completely right or completely wrong. Gray shades together with the complexities of the issue are ignored, and that is why simple together with powerful and emotional words have a greater influence on the crowd than any logical speech rich in data. They do not listen with their ears, but with their hearts, or more accurately, with their most primitive instincts. Have there been times when you felt yourself caught up in a movement, even though looking back it seemed a bit irrational then? That could be part of this effect. From the loss of individual consciousness along with the slavery to emotion, then another incredibly powerful feeling appears, which is the invincible power, the feeling of being surrounded by thousands and even tens of thousands of people with the same will along with the same purpose has created an illusion of infinite strength. He is no longer a weak or vulnerable individual, but he is part of a giant and invulnerable entity. The feeling of anonymity in the crowd makes the fear of consequences as well as individual responsibility vanish, because if everyone is doing it, then why should I alone be responsible? This is why actions that a normal individual would never dare to think of can be carried out boldly and even aggressively when that person is part of a crowd. They feel protected as well as sheltered, and more than that, are empowered to overcome all moral or legal limits that society has established. It is like when you cheer in a football match, when your shout, no matter how loud, is just a drop of water in the sea of sound from the stands. But that very feeling of being part of it makes you shout louder, along with more enthusiastically and beyond the limits of your normal self. Only the difference is that in the crowd, Le Bon studied then that boundary could be the boundary of civilization. Thus, when the impulsiveness, along with the lack of logic and the feeling of absolute power, has painted the first portrait of crowd psychology according to Le Bon, then we see a volatile together with unpredictable entity that harbors both the capacity for creation and destruction. But whether such a creature can be controlled, or if it is completely chaotic, then we will find out in the next chapter when discussing the suggestibility and credulity of the crowd. Chapter 3: Sentiments and Morality. The Exaggeration of Emotion. This is the part where Gustave Le Bon explores the extreme emotional amplitude of the crowd, and to be honest, what he wrote over 100 years ago is still incredibly true in our modern world. When an individual merges into the crowd, then what happens to their emotions, as Le Bon points out that the individual seems to lose the ability to perceive subtle nuances. Instead, their emotions, or rather the emotions of the crowd, only know two extremes, which are passionate love or bitter hatred, with no room for complexity, together with gray areas or halfway emotions. This is like an electric switch that can only be in the state of either on or off. Why is it so? Because when individual reason is paralyzed and the collective subconscious rises, then the most primitive instincts are released. Information or ideas received by the crowd do not go through logical filtering, but through emotional contagion, making a hero be cheered to the clouds just for a small action, or an enemy be hated to the bone for an accidental word. Emotion here is not the result of analysis, but of assimilation. Have you ever found yourself caught up in a collective wave of emotion, with a surge of anger or a joy of unclear origin, but which is very hard to resist? As that is exactly when you experience this simplicity and extremism. From this simplicity and extremism of emotion, then we arrive at another frightening characteristic of the crowd, which is intolerance and dictatorialness. When emotion is already extreme, then reason together with evidence or any counter-argument becomes meaningless, because the crowd does not accept debate. They do not want to debate, but they only want to believe so. Every difference together with every opposing opinion is considered a direct threat to the belief and to the collective emotion that is dominating. Imagine a child who only wants candy when you can explain candy is not good for health, together with giving however many scientific reasons. But if that child already wants it, then all words are useless and even stimulate resistance. The crowd is the same as they grant themselves the absolute right to protect their belief while not hesitating to impose their will on others and eliminate anyone who dares to challenge. This dictatorialness does not come from the intentional cruelty of each individual, but is the product of a collective psychology that has eliminated doubt together with reason. Do you see this on social media with those stoning sessions or deifications where the evidence is clearly wrong, but emotion still wins? Hearing this far, the crowd seems too negative, right? But Le Bon gives an unexpected and almost opposite perspective when also from this very extreme of emotion, the crowd sometimes leads to the extraordinary, which is the capacity for sacrifice and selfless altruism. It is paradoxical, is it not, when from the same origin of extreme emotion, but its opposite side is when the individual dissolves into the collective, then the boundary between the I and the we becomes blurred. The goal of the collective becomes the ultimate goal, and the power of a common ideal, together with an intense belief, can make people overcome personal fear, as well as overcome the survival instinct to sacrifice for others and for a higher purpose. You can see soldiers charging onto the battlefield together with volunteers forgetting themselves in disasters or even great revolutions where millions of people are willing to face danger to achieve an ideal. These are noble gestures, together with moments where we must bow before the altruism of human beings. The crowd on one frightening side can create tyrants, but on the other hand, it is also what can create saints together with unsung heroes. Thus, the crowd is a contradictory entity, as it exposes both the darkest and brightest sides of human nature, which are all extraordinarily amplified. It shows us that emotion, when escaping the control of individual reason and being shared collectively, will have a giant power enough to build and also enough to destroy. So how normal individuals can be caught up in that whirlpool of emotion, and who is the person directing that flow? Then we will find out in the next chapter. Chapter 4: Thinking in Images, the Death of Reasoning. The big question raised at this moment is how that collective soul actually thinks and how it processes information, as well as whether the way the crowd forms opinions is similar to an independent individual. This is exactly when we enter Chapter 4, titled Thinking in Images, or also known as the Death of Reasoning. Le Bon asserts, and I find this extremely worth reflecting on, that the crowd does not reason in a logical way. They do not analyze, nor do they ask questions, and they do not build chains of causal argument like a philosopher or a scientist, but instead, the crowd thinks in associative images. You should imagine it like this: when an event or an idea is transmitted to the crowd, then it is not received by the prefrontal cortex, which is the place for processing logic and our reason. Instead, it creates an image in their minds, and this image immediately activates a chain of other related images in an emotional and spontaneous way, without needing any tight, logical connection. It is like a dream, because in a dream, everything can overlap and be irrational, but we still believe in it at that moment, and the crowd is the same. For example, when you say justice, then a person with logical thinking will start to define together with analyzing the aspects of justice, but with the crowd. The word justice can immediately evoke the image of an oppressed hero or a punished villain or a certain unjust case, which are all powerful emotional images rather than an abstract concept. And when thinking in images, then what will happen to reason as it becomes helpless and completely helpless? Le Bon calls this the helplessness of reason before collective hallucinations. Just try to think about it. If the crowd only processes information through emotional images, then truth together with facts and evidence or tight arguments will become meaningless because they cannot penetrate the curtain of the collective hallucinations that have been created, because those images have become too real and too vivid in their minds, while most importantly, they have touched the emotions. I think perhaps you have witnessed this scene before, when trying to argue with logic against a person who has completely believed in a story or a belief built from powerful images, no matter how irrational. You will see all reasoning is useless when they do not listen and do not receive, because their reality has been shaped by that chain of emotional images already. So, where do these collective hallucinations come from, and how are they formed as well as spread? Le Bon pointed out that they often originate from myths and rumors spread without verification. In Le Bon's time, he witnessed stories about heroes being fabricated, along with about enemies being slandered, and about events being deified or demonized, which were all accepted without any evidence. They only need to have evocative power along with the power to move emotions. And in this 21st century, with the explosion of the internet, along with social media, this becomes much more frightening. A misleading photo or a cut video and a sensational headline, or simply a story told in a very emotional way, even if it is irrational, can quickly become a truth in the eyes of the crowd. We witness rumors about health, along with about politics, or even fabricated stories about famous people spreading like wildfire without anyone needing to check the source. just one image or one story with the power to move emotions is enough to automatically activate a chain of other images in the mind of the crowd to create a hallucination that reason cannot possibly break. This is exactly the death of reasoning, where truth is replaced by subjective perceptions and is manipulated by images. The lesson here is perhaps the self-awareness of how we receive information, and especially how we interact with a crowd, whether directly or on social media. So if the crowd only thinks in images and has no reason, then who is the person controlling those images? And who is the person planting in their minds the hallucinations with the power to shape an entire era is the question that we will go to find the answer for in the next chapter. Chapter 5. Religious Sentiment. The Form of All Crowd Beliefs. Hearing the name of this chapter, you might think Le Bon is about to talk about traditional religions such as Buddhism or Christianity or Islam. But in fact, it is not so, because Le Bon is a genius in looking through the surface to grasp the core essence. To him, religious sentiment is not limited to the worship of a deity with some superpower, but it is much broader. So, how does Le Bon define religious sentiment when it is a type of absolute and blind belief without a shred of doubt? It is a devotion to the point of irrationality and a willingness to sacrifice everything for a worshipped object, whether this object may be a god or a political ideal, along with a great leader and a doctrine, or even an abstract idea of justice or equality and freedom. The key here does not lie in what the worshipped object is, but in the degree of belief and submission. Just think about it. When a soldier is willing to sacrifice his life for his fatherland, or a revolutionary is willing to endure hardships to fight for a proletarian ideal, an obsessed fan is ready to protect their idol, regardless of all criticism, or a group of fanatics follows a new sect with ironclad faith in the leader's prophecy. All of those things, according to Le Bon, share the essence of religious sentiment because they all demonstrate blind submission along with unconditional adoration. But what has created this intense longing in the human heart when Le Bon argues that deep inside each individual there is always an instinctive need to submit and to belong to something greater than oneself? Becoming part of a crowd with the same belief brings a sense of security along with strength and purpose, while it releases the individual from the burden of independent thinking and personal responsibility. When you believe absolutely, then every question is answered and every complexity becomes simple. The need for an idol, whether it is a person or an idea and an object, is an indispensable part of this process. This idol becomes the center of all attention, and the source of all truth, as well as the support for all actions, without the need for reason or evidence, because belief alone is enough. That belief carries an irresistible gravitational pull to transform abstract ideas into specific commands for action, and turns the crowd into an invulnerable, unified block. Do you find this familiar when looking at our modern world with the field of politics, where we often see mass movements along with election campaigns, with slogans and symbols, along with leaders who are revered almost as divine? People do not just vote, but they also believe in a vision, along with a leader, regardless of any evidence or any counter-argument. That belief becomes the motivation for them to take to the streets for protests and even confront those who have differing views. Or in popular culture then, you look at the enthusiastic fan communities of a music group or a movie star and a technology brand. They are willing to spend thousands of dollars along with standing in long lines for hours and even harshly criticizing anyone who insults their idol. For them, the idol is not just a famous person, but a symbol along with a value that they live and breathe every day. Even on social media, then we can see digital tribes forming around an influencer or a hashtag or an ideological trend. These people protect their views resolutely and are ready to cancel those who are not on the same side. This is also a form of religious belief through the blind acceptance of a viewpoint and hostility toward anything that threatens that belief. Le Bon does not judge whether religious belief is good or bad, but he only describes a profound psychological phenomenon of the crowd. He points out that whether it is worshiping a deity or worshiping a nation along with an ideal or a leader, then the form of submission and adoration remains consistent. Identifying religious belief in different forms of the crowd is the first step for us to better understand how social movements form, along with develop and sometimes dissolve. It reminds us of the terrible power of blind faith, along with the vulnerability of reason to manipulation when humans become part of a crowd. Chapter 6: Remote Factors, Race, Tradition, and Time. In the previous chapters, we have gone deep into how the crowd reacts, along with direct stimuli and the role of leaders, while we have also seen the explosive power of the crowd when triggered. However, like every iceberg, then what we see on the surface, including anger along with passion and change, is actually only the tip. Below and deep in the flow of history, along with human psychology, are giant forces which are slower, but have the power to shape everything much more profoundly. Today, we will explore Chapter 6 on remote factors, including race, along with tradition and time, which are the foundations shaping crowd thinking across generations. Le Bon starts with a concept that today might be controversial, but is the kernel of his thought on foundational factors when he calls it the racial soul or racial spirit. This is something that goes beyond the biological characteristics we usually think of when talking about race, because to Le Bon, this is a synthesis of psychological characteristics, along with ways of thinking and feeling, as well as acting, accumulated over thousands of generations and then passed down. You should imagine it like this, when it is not just skin color or physique, but also an invisible treasure of experiences, along with beliefs and values, as well as prejudices, including both good and bad, and also instincts deeply engraved in the collective subconscious of a group of people. It is like the operating system of a computer shaping the way a people decodes the world, along with how they react to ideas and how they absorb or reject appeals. An appeal can cause a powerful effect in one people, but be completely meaningless to another because their racial soul has been programmed differently. Le Bon argues that this racial soul itself is the foundational factor and the deepest sedimentary layer to determine the common characteristics of the crowd in a certain culture. It is the core essence that no matter how much the surface factors change, then this foundation remains difficult to shake. Next, Le Bon shifts attention to a closer but no less powerful factor, which is tradition. It sounds a bit strange, right? Because when talking about the crowd, then we usually think of explosion along with disruption and revolution. But Le Bon affirms a seemingly paradoxical thing, that the crowd, which seems to always want to break everything, is actually the most conservative of all. Tradition, according to Le Bon, consists of ideas along with customs and habits that have been accepted as well as practiced by society over many generations. Whether we want to or not, then we are all shaped by these things because they create stability and create a framework for society to function. To understand better, then you should think about the customs in your hometown, or even the implicit rules of conduct in the family or office, which are things that have eaten so deep into us that we no longer ask questions about them. When a new idea appears, then it must face the solid wall of tradition. So no matter how reasonable it sounds, then an idea going against tradition will meet fierce resistance from the crowd. Why is it so? Because tradition brings security along with familiarity and a sense of belonging. Breaking tradition is like personally tearing up the map that we have used to orient ourselves our whole lives so the crowd does not want to risk entering an unfamiliar land, even if it seems more promising. Therefore, Le Bon emphasizes that building a sustainable society needs to respect and maintain core traditions rather than arbitrarily breaking them. And finally, is a seemingly passive but extremely powerful factor, which is time. Le Bon does not look at time as a creator of everything, but as a preparatory factor and a silent nurturer. Time does not create great ideas by itself, but it allows those ideas to germinate, along with develop and take deep root in the crowd mind, then ripen to explode. A great idea or an ideological revolution never appears overnight, but it needs decades and even hundreds of years to slowly penetrate into thinking, then change norms and erode old beliefs. Think about the French Revolution. When it was not a sudden fire, but the result of centuries of accumulated dissatisfaction, along with ideas of freedom and equality, gradually permeating every corner of society. Time is exactly the catalyst that helps those great changes become reality. Time is also a double-edged sword when it can build and consolidate beliefs along with institutions, but it also has the ability to destroy by eroding old beliefs that are no longer suitable, as well as weakening outdated institutions to clear the way for newer things. To Le Bon, then, no single factor is eternal, because everything lies in the flow of time and change, no matter how slow then, is still inevitable. So, we have, together, gone through these three remote factors, including the racial soul, along with tradition and time. They are not as noisy as leaders, and not as immediate as shouts, but they are the undercurrent shaping everything from deep within to create the foundational structure for all behaviors of the crowd. Hope these analyses have helped you have a deeper insight into the invisible but extremely powerful forces shaping our society. You should reflect on which racial souls are affecting your community and which traditions are holding us back or pushing us forward, as well as how the factor of time is impacting the changes around us. In the next chapter, we will delve into some more direct factors, which are the actual fires that can ignite the crowd. Chapter 7. Proximate factors, images, words, and formulae. Imagine a manipulator standing before a giant crowd when they understand collective psychology and they know the crowd operates by emotion rather than reason. So what buttons will they use to control when Le Bon points out three main tools, and we will explore each one in turn. First is the magical power of words. If you have ever wondered why seemingly amorphous words can blow up an entire revolution or submerge a nation, then Le Bon has the answer for you. He says that for the crowd, words are not just a means of communication, but they are magic, along with living entities which have the capacity to evoke incredibly powerful images and emotions. Just think about words like freedom or hope, together with democracy or even justice. We all use them, and we all understand them. But does anyone define exactly what they are in every context when Le Bon calls them hollow words because they do not carry a specific, clear definition or any fixed pattern? However, that very hollowness is their strength, because they allow each individual in the crowd to fill them with their own images, along with desires and longings. When a speaker shouts about freedom, then the farmer thinks about escaping taxes, while the prisoner thinks about being released, and the intellectual thinks about the right to speak. Each person has an image, but all feel a powerful wave of emotion surging. Because these words do not need to be correct, or do not need to be logical, but they only need to be evocative and awaken the deepest emotional strings in the crowd soul. Le Bon likens them to buttons that just need to be touched for a whole world of emotion to burst open, because the crowd does not analyze the meaning, but they feel the weight along with the beauty of the words, and that very feeling is what drives them to act. Second is the way of using short slogans to control the mind. From the power of words, then, Le Bon leads us to an even more direct tool, which is slogans, or as he calls them, formulae. If those words are magic, then the slogan is the incantation simplified to the maximum to be repeated. The crowd does not have the capacity to remember or process complex information, so what they need is simplicity, along with clarity, and most importantly, repetition. A short, along with easy-to-remember slogan being repeated enough times will gradually penetrate the subconscious of the crowd to overcome all barriers of reason. It does not need to be explained, or does not need to be convinced by argument, but it just needs to be stuck into the mind. Look at political slogans or advertising, or the shouts in protests, which usually consist of only a few words, but carry the weight of an entire ideology, along with a goal such as "just do it," or "country first," and "we can." These sentences do not encourage critical thinking, but they encourage unconditional acceptance, as well as instinctive action to become a type of unquestionable truth, because they have been engraved into the mind through unceasing repetition. Third is the necessity of illusion, when the crowd would rather believe in a beautiful illusion than the naked truth. This is perhaps one of the bitter but also deepest observations of Le Bon, because the crowd does not seek the truth, but they seek comfort along with consolation and an easy-to-understand story along with a bright future. The truth, especially naked and harsh truths, is often very complex, along with painful and hard to accept. Le Bon argues that illusions along with illusory beliefs are the lifeblood of nations because without them, they would decay. Because illusion brings hope along with goals and brings an ideal image of the world as well as of themselves. A talented leader, according to Le Bon, is not the person who tells the harsh truth, but the person who has the capacity to create as well as maintain beautiful illusions in the mind of the crowd. Think about the promises of a heaven later, or about a coming golden age, or about a clear enemy to blame. The crowd does not want to know that the problem is very complex, along with having no easy solution, and sometimes they themselves are part of the problem. They want a simple solution, along with a clear path and a hero to worship, as well as a villain to hate. This may not be easy to accept, but Le Bon shows that for crowd psychology, a beautiful dream, even if artificial, is still much more attractive than an ugly reality. In summary, in this chapter 7, then Gustave Le Bon has pointed out the direct and powerful tools that crowd manipulators use, which are the magic of evocative but hollow words, along with the penetration of short and repeated slogans, and above all, the capacity to create beautiful illusions that the crowd craves. These lessons, which were written over a century ago, still remain valid until today, when we witness the spread of information along with political campaigns and the influence of social media. In the next chapter, we will explore more deeply another important factor, which is the capacity for contagion of emotion and behavior in the crowd. Chapter 8, Leaders of Crowds, the Spark Plugs. After having gone deep into crowd psychology, along with their basic characteristics and suggestibility, then, today, we will shift our direction to an extremely important subject, which is indispensable in every movement or every historical event, being the spark plugs and the invisible architects of every movement, or the leaders of crowds. Who are they, and what do they do? While where does their power come from to be able to move thousands and even millions of people? Le Bon classifies leaders into two main types. When clearly understanding these two types will help us see the different motivations in forming well as maintaining the crowd. First is the temporary orator, when you can imagine them as people who can emerge in a specific moment to skillfully grasp the mood of the crowd at that very time, then lead them in an event or a short-term protest. They can be a talented speaker, along with a person with the ability to speak attractively and convince quickly. But sometimes their belief is not truly deep or sustainable, because they are like fires burning intensely, but also easily dying out. On the contrary, and this is exactly the characters that Le Bon particularly emphasizes, which is the constant apostle. you just think of people obsessed by a belief, along with a fixed idea, when they possess an intense as well as unshakable faith and are ready to sacrifice everything for it. They are not people who change with the wind, but are people who create the wind. Starting from revolutionaries along with missionaries to the founders of great ideologies who all carry within them an iron will that nothing can break. And this is exactly the key point to distinguish in order to create a truly influential leader, which is not intelligence or wisdom, and even innate eloquence, but rather it is strong will. You know when Le Bon argues that high intelligence is sometimes even a burden for those who want to lead the crowd. A person who is too intelligent, along with too rational, will easily see the absurdity as well as the contradiction in the emotional appeals of the crowd, making them hesitate, then analyze, and finally lose the necessary charisma to lead the masses who are longing to be led. On the contrary, then, a leader with an iron as well as unceasing will, even if sometimes they may lack the subtlety of reason, has an extraordinary capacity for exerting influence. They believe in what they say, absolutely, to the point that the belief itself becomes a spreading energy. So how do these leaders, and especially the constant apostles, manage to infect the crowd with their belief, when Le Bon explains this through a process that he calls affirmation, along with repetition and contagion? First, then they affirm their idea strongly, without needing proof or needing debate, because for the crowd, a decisive along with confident affirmation is more persuasive than 1,000 rambling explanations. After that, they repeat those affirmations unceasingly through every possible channel and on every forum. It is just like advertising, when repeating enough will make the message imprinted deep into the subconscious to become an unquestionable truth in the mind of the crowd. And finally, when the message is strong enough, along with repeated enough, then it will spread. The crowd with the characteristic of being easily suggested, along with imitative behavior, will receive that belief unconsciously. The will of the leader, along with their fanatical belief, creates an energy field that the crowd is drawn into, making them not understand, but only feel, then be swept away. This contagion is almost like a form of collective hypnosis, where individual reason is suspended, and the leader's emotions and beliefs are spread like a contagious disease. In summary, then, these spark plugs are not great thinkers in the academic sense, but are figures with a will of steel, along with an intense belief, and the ability to spread that belief tirelessly. They are the ones who create waves, as well as shape the flow of history by touching the deepest emotional strings of human beings in the crowd. And that is why understanding their role is so important when we analyze the power and sometimes the potential danger of the crowd. In the next chapter, we will delve deeper into the factors that trigger the crowd into action and the most effective methods of persuasion. Chapter 9: The Means of Action. Affirmation, Repetition, and Contagion. We will dive deeper into a subject that might be a bit dark, but is extremely necessary to understand how this world operates, as it is exactly the means of action, including affirmation, along with repetition and contagion. Or to put it more bluntly then, this is the technical formula for crowd manipulation, which sounds scary, but let us dissect it together. Because only when we understand this formula can we protect ourselves and have a more clear-sighted view of the things happening around us. Le Bon is not just a diagnostician, but he is also almost a guide on how to apply these principles of crowd psychology when the three main tools he provides for an idea to penetrate and control the crowd mind are pure affirmation, along with repetition and contagion. Le Bon says that when you want an idea to be accepted by the crowd, then the first thing to do is to affirm it in a simple, along with clear and decisive way. You do not need to present logical arguments, or do not need evidence and do not need debate, because even trying to prove it only makes the idea become weaker. Think about it like this. When the individual mind may demand reasoning, but the crowd mind operates quite differently, because the crowd does not have enough patience or the ability for deep analysis. They need simplicity along with certainty, so an eloquent and confident affirmation will directly enter their subconscious to bypass the already fragile layer of reason of the crowd. Have you ever seen advertising slogans like, "Our product is the best," or "Buy now to have a better life"? And in politics, "We will bring greatness," or "The opponent is a threat." They do not provide a long thesis explaining why the product is the best or how they will bring greatness, but they just affirm that. And that very decisiveness, along with that absence of doubt, is exactly its strength. Because Le Bon believes that an affirmation given in a more uncompromising and unhesitating way has more capacity to create a hypnotic effect on the crowd, like an absolute command instead of a proposal to consider. But an affirmation, no matter how powerful, still needs another tool to turn it into a firm belief, which is repetition. This is the point where I find Le Bon truly ahead of his time, when he saw the power of brainwashing through repetition. When an affirmation is repeated unceasingly, then it will gradually soak into the subconscious of the crowd, so that initially it may only be an echo, but over time that echo becomes a familiar melody, and finally an unshakable truth. Le Bon likens it to repetition, turning an idea from a vague concept into a truth engraved into the depths of the unconscious. because our minds, and especially the subconscious, do not have a mechanism for overly strict censorship against repeated information, but it accepts them as part of reality. Have you ever wondered why advertisers spend billions of dollars to show the same advertisement with the same message hundreds of times? Or why politicians have anchor phrases that they repeat in every speech? That is the direct application of this principle. When initially you might feel annoyed, then later you find it familiar, and one day you realize you have learned that message by heart, and even worse, have started to believe in it unconsciously. Repetition has the ability to blur the boundary between truth and falsehood in the crowd mind, making a false thing, if repeated enough and long enough, become the truth in collective perception, because the crowd will gradually forget the source of information and accept it as part of background knowledge. However, affirmation and repetition alone are not enough for an idea to dominate. So how an idea already seeded and watered in the subconscious of some people can spread to the entire society? Then Le Bon's answer is contagion, which is a psychological phenomenon like an epidemic. This is the point where I find Le Bon extremely sharp, when he realizes that opinions do not spread through rational debate, but through unconscious imitation and emotion. When an idea, along with an emotion and a belief, has become strong enough in a small group, then it will start to spread to those around like a disease. You see one person starting to believe and act in a certain way, then other people also imitate, without needing to think too much. In a crowd, and especially when common emotion rises high, then this contagion takes place at lightning speed, making fear spread along with enthusiasm spread, and a wave of outrage sweep through. Le Bon explains that in the crowd, the individual loses identity along with independent will, so they become easily influenced by surrounding emotions and ideas. An action performed by one person, if powerful enough and persuasive enough meaning, it has been affirmed and repeated, can quickly be imitated by thousands of others without needing any rational consideration. Look at fashion trends, along with social media trends, or even mass panics. When one person starts, then the people around see, and because of the herd instinct, along with because of the fear of being left behind, or simply because of the unconscious urge to imitate, so they also participate, so that from there, the idea or action spreads like a wildfire. In summary, then, we have together gone through the 3 pillars in Gustave Le Bon's crowd manipulation formula, which are pure affirmation, along with repetition and contagion. These 3 factors, when combined skillfully, can turn even the most absurd idea into a firm belief and a powerful movement in the crowd mind. This is not a lesson in morality, but a technical analysis of how ideas are spread, as well as consolidated in a society where crowd psychology frequently predominates. Understanding these mechanisms is not so that we become manipulators, but so that we become conscious individuals in order to identify and analyze the messages we receive every day. It helps us be more alert, along with less swept away by emotional waves and more confident in our independent thinking ability. In the next chapter, we will continue to explore another important aspect, which is the leader of the crowd, to see who is the person capable of applying these tools most effectively and what characteristics they have. Chapter 10. Prestige, the invisible power. We have together gone through many interesting and somewhat frightening aspects of the unpredictable behavior of the crowd in the book titled The Crowd by Gustave Le Bon. We have talked about the individual transformation when merging into the collective, along with the power of suggestion and the role of imagination. So today, we will delve into another concept that Le Bon considers the master key to all domination, which is prestige. We often understand prestige as the reliability, along with the respect that a person or an organization possesses. But to Le Bon, prestige is an invisible power and a feeling of reverence, along with admiration or even fear that we have for a person or an idea or an object. It does not need reasoning, along with not needing evidence, because it is already a command in itself. And most notably, prestige has the capacity to completely paralyze the judgmental ability of others. Le Bon classifies prestige into two main forms, which is an extremely important point for us to better understand how it operates. First is artificial prestige, or prestige acquired from the outside, and this is the type of prestige attached to position, along with social status and wealth, as well as titles or even the uniform that a person wears. Just think about it. When a high-ranking official, even if sometimes having no outstanding achievements, but just the seat they are sitting in, has brought them a certain respect. A wealthy businessman, along with a scientist with dozens of degrees, or a general with glittering medals, all possess a type of prestige built from external factors. It is like a magnificent coat, which is easily acquired and also easily stripped away. When the term of office ends, or when money runs out, and when titles no longer have value, then artificial prestige will also vanish. Second, and a much more powerful type of prestige, is personal prestige, or self-prestige. This is the prestige emanating from the person themselves without needing any support from the outside, because it comes from superior intelligence, along with extraordinary talent and immense courage, as well as absolute confidence or an inexplicable charisma. Think about a brilliant scientist like Albert Einstein, or a genius artist like Leonardo da Vinci, and a visionary leader. when they do not need titles for others to listen and respect. Their prestige is innate as well as tempered through experience along with achievement. So this type of prestige is much harder to acquire, but once had its power is extremely great and sustainable while being less affected by changes in external circumstances. So how does prestige paralyze the judgmental ability of others when Le Bon argues that when an individual or an idea has prestige, then the crowd will receive it without any analysis or consideration? They do not ask questions along with not countering, but simply accept unconditionally, just like being hypnotized, so the crowd will follow the orders of the prestigious person, no matter how irrational that order is. In today's information explosion era, then we see this very clearly through a product advertised by a prestigious star or news coming from a prestigious media channel or advice from an expert, making us easily accept everything without asking questions about the authenticity or the motive behind. Prestige creates an invisible barrier to prevent reason from working, and instead, it is the emotion of reverence, along with submission. But prestige is not invulnerable because it can be destroyed, and Le Bon has pointed out two main ways. First, and perhaps the most obvious, is failure, because the crowd never forgives failure. A defeated general or a politician failing in an election and a bankrupt business all immediately diminish or lose prestige, no matter how many successes they had before then. Once they fail, the halo of prestige will fade or disappear completely, because the crowd in its cruelty along with irrationality will quickly turn their backs on the losers. Second, and somewhat more subtle, is free discussion. Prestige lives thanks to blind reverence along with the absence of criticism. So as soon as the light of reason, along with open and free discussion, shines in, then the illusions that prestige has built will start to shatter. When people are allowed to discuss along with dissect and ask questions about the origin, as well as the basis of prestige, then the mystery along with its power will gradually be removed. Le Bon understands this very well, because free discussion is the greatest enemy of all forms of irrational prestige when it strips away the truth along with exposing weaknesses and dissolving all illusions that prestige has built. This is also the reason why many dictatorships often restrict freedom of speech, because they know that once the crowd starts to think and discuss freely, then the prestige of the ruler will face the risk of collapse. Thus, prestige is an invisible power and is both a tool to build influence as well as a bond restricting the judgment of the crowd. It is elusive, but also vulnerable. So the important thing is that we need to be aware of its existence, along with understanding how it operates to be able to protect ourselves from negative impacts, and more importantly, to build a genuine prestige for ourselves. What do you think about the concept of prestige that Le Bon has analyzed, and whether we are being blindly affected by prestige in our daily life? Then please share your thoughts in the comments. In the next chapter, we will continue to explore deeper motivations about the crowd. Chapter 11, Classification of Crowds from Criminals to Juries. Le Bon does not just talk about crowds in general, but he also dissects them into many different types, which each type having its own manifestations and consequences. While you will see that no matter where it is, then crowd psychology still operates silently and sometimes in ways that we do not expect. The first point we need to consider is criminal crowds. When we usually imagine inhuman people together with a total loss of reason and committing cruel acts, which sounds a bit hard to accept. But Le Bon has another much deeper perspective when he points out that the cruelest acts of a crowd often do not stem from pure malice, but from a strong belief that they are executing justice. Just try to think about it in history. Then riots together, with looting and even collective executions, like what happened in the French Revolution or uprisings in many places, were often carried out under the banner of a certain ideal, such as against oppression, or punishing the wicked, and reclaiming fairness. In crowd psychology, then the hypnosis by a simple, together with extreme idea, combined with a sense of anonymity and no personal responsibility, makes each member believe that their action is right and even a duty. So they do not feel that they are committing a crime, but they believe that they are solving a problem, because personal sympathy, together with compassion, suddenly disappears to make room for collective fervor. Once the crowd has been led by their own notion of justice, then the boundary between right and wrong becomes blurred, and every behavior, no matter how brutal, can be justified, because this shows even the best intentions can be terribly distorted when falling into the hands of a crowd. Continuing this story, then we move on to another type of crowd that sounds much more civilized and rational. Being criminal juries, which is a group of people carefully selected with the purpose of considering evidence objectively to make a fair judgment, making us expect them to be independent individuals together with logical thinking. However, Le Bon once again offers a controversial perspective when he argues that the jury in essence is still a crowd, and when sitting together in the courtroom, then the characteristics of crowd psychology start to appear, making their decisions, instead of being based on a tight analysis of legal evidence, then usually being strongly dominated by emotion. A good lawyer does not just present facts, but must also know how to evoke emotions, because sympathy for the victim, together with pity for the defendant, or even personal dislike for one side, can profoundly impact the verdict. As an emotional defense, together with a tragic story and a pitiful image, can sometimes be more persuasive than dozens of dry pieces of evidence. Juries are easily affected by opinions with psychological power, together with by the repetition of simple arguments or by the invisible pressure from the general opinion of the group, making them often simplify the problem to seek a clear story about good and bad people instead of a complex matrix of events and evidence, raising the question of whether our legal system, with the expectation of absolute impartiality, is facing an inherent challenge from human nature itself. Crowd psychology also creeps into fields considered the peak of reason and civilization, being politics, as Le Bon is particularly interested in the psychology of electors and parliaments. First is electors, when he observes that electors are also a crowd because they rarely vote based on a deep understanding of complex policies or the actual capacity of candidates, but instead they are attracted by easy-to-remember slogans together with hollow promises and carefully constructed images. Electors often react to simple together with clear and symbolic ideas rather than logical arguments with depth, because they are easily persuaded by strong emotions, including fear, together with hope and anger that politicians skillfully know how to evoke. So candidates do not need to be truly intelligent or visionary, but they only need to know how to create an image, together with a story that moves the crowd. This is perhaps not surprising to many of us today, when media and social networks make this process more evident than ever. And even when we think of parliaments, which are places gathering people supposed to be the elite, representing the nation's wisdom. Then Le Bon still sees the shadow of crowd psychology. Although each individual deputy may be an educated together with rational person, but when they gather into a legislative body, then they are still dominated by the laws of the crowd. So in Parliament, then debates are often not about the truth or the rationality of the problem, but are a battle of eloquent words together with emotional performances and manipulative tricks. A good speaker can change the outcome of a vote not by logic, but by the power of emotional persuasion, together with by the ability to evoke enthusiasm or outrage in the majority. While decisions are often made due to pressure from public opinion, together with from political parties or from the contagion of a sudden idea. Parliaments, according to Le Bon, often tend to act conservatively in small matters, but are extremely progressive in large matters because they are easily drawn by new, together with flashy ideas, without carefully considering the consequences, making parliamentary meetings together with debates on the floor, sometimes just a play staged to serve a certain purpose, rather than a serious and effective exchange. Le Bon has taken us through a journey from crowds considered the lowest, like criminals, to gatherings considered the most noble of society, like juries and parliaments, to point out that no matter who and no matter in what position, then when humans gather into a crowd, they all risk losing individual reason together with being dominated by emotion and suggestion, as well as simple ideas. This does not mean that we must be pessimistic about society or look down on every collective, but above all, it is a profound reminder of the fragility of human reason when facing the overwhelming power of crowd psychology and understanding. This is the first step for us to be more alert, together with protecting ourselves from negative impacts, while finding ways to build communities together with collectives truly capable of thinking and acting in a wiser way. In the next chapter, we will continue to explore other special types of crowds, and perhaps we'll be even more surprised about what Le Bon realized more than a century ago. Chapter 12, The Voting Crowd, The Art of Political Persuasion. Politics is the greatest stage of humanity, and the place where Le Bon's ideas become more vivid than ever. So, our goal today is to explore an aspect that perhaps none of us want to admit, but always exists, which is how candidates manipulate our votes. I bet that after listening, then you will look at every election campaign with a completely different eye, because the first point, and also the foundation that Le Bon points out, is that the crowd, which in this case is the voters, does not care at all about objective truth or complex plans. What they truly want is to be flattered and hear visionary promises, which is something that sounds very familiar right when you look and see in every election campaign. Then candidates always find ways to make voters feel like they are the center of the universe. They will say that you are the future of the country, or you are the smartest and most clear-sighted people, as well as you deserve to enjoy the best things. But those words are actually no different from a sweet opium to lull our rational analysis capability. They constantly paint a bright future to the point of being unrealistic, such as a booming economy without effort or a flawless, fair society. Along with every problem will be solved just by a few miraculous policies which Le Bon calls creating illusions, which are things that the crowd craves to believe are true. Don't we all like to be praised and hear the things we want to hear? So, that is the weakness that politicians masterfully exploit. Not stopping there then, the second factor named prestige is also extremely important when Le Bon spent a large part talking about the power of prestige as an almost mystical power and can overwhelm all logical reasoning. Prestige can be personal prestige, originating from talent, along with personality, or prestige acquired from position and status. So in politics then, candidates use prestige to completely overwhelm competitors. They build their own image as a savior, along with an unquestionable leader and a person with a glorious past, even if sometimes it is just painted and added to. They will declare that I am the only one capable enough, or history has proven I am always right as well as only. I have the vision to lead the country. So when a candidate has prestige, then all their words, even if appearing irrational, will be easily accepted by the crowd. Conversely then, they will find every way to destroy the prestige of the opponent by smearing along with doubting or simply lowering the value of the opponent's achievements, making prestige a solid wall that makes all attacks with the opponent's reasoning useless and even counterproductive. It's like when you meet a person that everyone says is a genius, then you tend to believe everything they say without needing to verify again. And finally, a harsh truth that Le Bon exposed is that logical reasoning often fails miserably before emotional attacks in politics, because the crowd does not think in a systematic, logical way, but they think with images, along with emotions and with instinctive reactions. Ask yourself that the last time you changed your mind about a political issue. Was it because of a complex chart about the economy, or because of a story that touched your heart along with an emotional call for fairness or the fear of a certain threat? Le Bon affirms that to impact the crowd, then you must speak in their language, which is the language of simplicity, along with of strong emotions. So candidates understand this very well when they do not waste time explaining policies thoroughly, but instead they focus on evoking patriotism along with the fear of enemies and the indignation before injustice or the hope for a better life. They use strong slogans along with moving stories and inspiring or frightening images, because a calculated speech along with tight logic but dry will never have power equal to a short speech along with full of enthusiasm and touching straight the emotions of the crowd. That is because emotions spread in the crowd faster than a virus, while reason needs space along with time to permeate, which is something the crowd does not have at all. Therefore, through the perspective of Gustave Le Bon, then we clearly see that the political stage is a big play, where candidates are talented directors along with actors when they do not necessarily have to tell the truth, but must say what the crowd wants to hear while having to build unshakable prestige and having to control emotions instead of reason. With these insights, then, I hope you will become wiser voters, along with being less manipulated to always ask questions and seek the truth behind those flowery words, along with those strong emotions. Chapter 13, The Life Cycle of Civilizations, rise and fall. In this chapter, then Le Bon does not just look at street protests or political conferences, but he takes us on a flight through time to contemplate the role of the crowd in the entire process of formation, along with development and decay of civilizations. It is like you are reading an epic poem, but with Le Bon as the narrator and the crowd as the main character. So let us begin our journey from the formation stage, which is the transformation process from a chaotic crowd into an organized nation. Imagine a primitive time when humans lived in a primitive state, along with being detached like undefined grains of sand, which Le Bon calls the primitive chaotic crowd, when they had no common purpose as well as no rules and only acted on immediate instinct. So what can connect millions of people together to transform them from fragmented individuals into a unified block, along with a nation with identity and will, as well as the ability to build great structures? Then, according to Le Bon, that is a common ideal. This ideal can be a religious belief, or a divine leader, or a revolutionary political theory, and a noble national goal. When this ideal appears along with becoming deeply ingrained in the mind of the crowd, then it becomes a form of faith and a common soul that every individual in the crowd accepts, along with follows unconsciously. It is this very common soul that creates discipline, along with order and direction, to transform grains of sand into a solid monolithic block, helping everyone accept the sacrifice of personal interests for the common good, as well as for something more transcendent than themselves. At this point, the crowd has surpassed the initial chaotic state to become an organized nation, which can confidently lay the first bricks for a civilization through forming laws, along with building temples and retelling epic stories. Continuing the journey is the peak stage when the common ideal begins to dominate. Because when this ideal has taken deep root, then it becomes the compass for every action, along with every decision of the nation. And this is the golden age of civilization. That ideal governs every aspect of life, from law, along with art and architecture, to morality as well as education, making humans live along with work with an intense belief and an almost absolute consensus. Everyone points towards one goal along with one common vision. So in this stage, then the crowd, although still retaining its nature of being easily dominated by emotion, but is led by a powerful and positive collective soul. They have the ability to perform great feats, such as building sky-high pyramids, along with creating immortal artistic masterpieces and conquering new lands or establishing powerful empires. Le Bon observes that the greatest strength of a civilization does not come from outstanding individual intelligence, but comes from the unity of will along with the belief of a giant mass of people led by an unshakable common ideal, which is the power of the crowd when it is correctly directed and has a noble purpose to dedicate to. Sadly, when nothing is eternal, even the greatest ideals, because Le Bon believes that every civilization must go through a decay stage, and the deepest cause is exactly the erosion of the common ideal. Over time, then, the initial beliefs begin to be doubted, making the values long revered become outdated, along with questioned and finally abandoned due to the development of science shaking religious belief, or the appearance of opposing new ideas, or simply the fatigue along with boredom when an ideal has existed for too long. When the common ideal dies, then the collective soul of the nation also disintegrates, making the crowd no longer have an invisible string to bind them. So each individual returns to their own ego, along with selfish interests and desires. The spirit of sacrifice for the common good disappears to give way to division, along with suspicion, making the crowd become weak, as well as easily swayed and manipulated by demagogues, along with hollow promises. They no longer have the capacity for self-control, along with self-direction, so chaos returns at a more subtle and dangerous level when the law is disregarded along with morality declining, and all social order begins to collapse. Le Bon describes this stage as a civilization rotting from within, when the nation from being a solid block becomes once again a fragmented collection of undefined grains of sand, like at the beginning. They lose identity, along with losing strength, and finally become easy prey for other civilizations that are at their peak stage or collapse themselves within their own chaos. Thus, we have gone through the life cycle of civilizations with Le Bon, where the crowd is not only a participant, but also the architect, along with the maintainer, and also the destroyer. It sounds pessimistic, but this is a thorough look, along with a warning from the past, that we can still see the traces as well as the repetitions of in human history until today. The question raised is, what can we do when we recognize the first cracks on the wall of our common ideal, and whether there is a way to prolong the peak stage, or even rebirth a dead ideal, are exactly the questions that Le Bon leaves for us to ponder. So we have gone through a quite deep journey together to explore the complex psychological layers of the crowd through Gustave Le Bon's perspective, a book that can be said to have changed the way I perceive many social phenomena around me. After going through Le Bon's pages, then maybe some of you will feel a bit dangerous when reading these things, or even give rise to thoughts about how to control the crowd. But remember that the purpose of clearly understanding crowd psychology, according to me, is not for us to become manipulators or control others at all, no, but for us to equip ourselves with a spiritual shield. This helps protect ourselves from emotional waves, along with hasty decisions or blind trends that can sweep us away without timely consideration. It is a tool for self-reflection, along with self-mastery, and to maintain positions, as well as the individual self amidst a volatile sea of people, rather than to dominate or manipulate. Understanding the crowd is so that we do not become its victims, or worse, become a part of unconscious frenzy. And speaking of trends then, this brings me to a question that I really want to hear your opinions from you who are watching this video. That have you ever felt regret because you accidentally followed a certain trend yet? It could be a fashion trend, or a hot trend on social networks, or a way of thinking, and even a big decision in life that looking back later, then you see you were influenced too much by the majority, by the so-called crowd psychology. How did that feeling feel, and what made you realize you made a mistake, or at least were not completely comfortable with that decision? So please share your story along with your thoughts in the comments section below. I believe that each story contains valuable lessons that we can learn from each other to together perceive more clearly the crowd's influence on personal life. If you find this video useful and want to continue exploring other classic books in the field of social psychology, as well as books that help us understand ourselves along with the world around us in a deeper and more multi-dimensional way, then do not forget to click the subscribe button of my channel. Subscribing will help you not miss any profound analysis in the future, and at the same time is also a great motivation for me to continue creating even better quality content. So please turn on the notification bell to receive news as soon as there is a latest video. Thank you very much for accompanying me on the journey to decode the crowd by Gustave Le Bon today, and hope that these shares will bring you fresh perspectives along with value so that we live in a more mindful and autonomous way. See you again in the next videos.